Hello, and welcome to LGIU's Fireside Chat, where we're joined by guests from around the world to discuss what the future holds for local government, with an emphasis firmly on what the sector can do now to start preparing for that future. I'm Jonathan Carr-West, I'm Chief Exec of LGIU, and I'm delighted today to be sitting down with Adele Gritten. Adele is Chief Executive of Local Partnerships, a role that she's been doing since, I think, November 2022. We'll hear a bit more about local partnerships shortly, but they're an in-house public sector delivery partner jointly owned by the LGA, HM Treasury, and Welsh Government, who work with government departments, local government, a whole range of people doing some really interesting consultancy and support work. Now, we're very proud to say that local partnerships are one of LGIU's founding strategic partners, and we're really excited to be working together with them to support local authorities across the UK. Adele came to local partnerships with a really interesting background in the private and public sector. She was head of economic development and commercial investments at South Cambridgeshire District Council. She's had many years of senior management roles for a range of professional services consultancies. She was at YouGov. She's been at all sorts of interesting places. So she's got a really, as both a sort of insider, outsider, someone who's embedded in the sector, but relatively new. She's got an incredible perspective on what's going on now. So Adele, welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
So look, many of our listeners, viewers will be very familiar with local partnerships, but for any who are not, could you explain a little bit about who local partnerships are and how you work with councils and other partners in the sector?
Yeah, sure. And you stole my thunder a little bit by giving the kind of headline introduction as to who we are and the ownership structure, but it is fairly unique. So as you alluded to, we are effectively a joint venture between the LGA, Treasury and the Welsh Government. And our purpose is really quite simple. We're here to support the public sector, specifically local government, central government departments and devolved administrations deliver better outcomes. So our strapline is that we deliver value and efficacy for the public purse. So that could mean financial savings, it could mean organizational and operational efficiencies, it could mean net zero related efficiencies, or it can mean quite often more qualitative or softer outcomes such as social value, etc. So we're effectively an in-house delivery partner supporting change, improvement and sector betterment. We work in England and Wales currently because of the ownership structure. I've done a little bit for the Scottish Government. Predominantly our footprint is across England and Wales. And we in any 1 week could be working with districts, counties, the unitaries, combined authorities, city regions. We've done some work for national parks, fire and rescue authorities, central government departments. So it's a breadth and depth across the public sector ecosystem. And I guess the people we have got backgrounds in local government, they've got backgrounds in central government, there's got commercial expertise and quite a bit of technical skill set as well. So a really rich and diverse set of skill sets to bring to the complex kind of projects and programs of the day.
Yeah. And tell us a bit more about, I think that ownership structure is really interesting. As you say, effectively a joint venture, but why do you think, what impact does that have on the way you work and the way in which you connect with the public sector?
From where I sit, it's a really unique and privileged ownership structure. There isn't anything else out there like us. I don't think there's anything else out there with that tripartite structure. So we are very unique in that sense. And what it means is that we can often act as that sort of interface or bridge between central government policy decision making and local implementation. So we sometimes obviously commission directly by the LGA or with councils directly on projects, but often we're commissioned directly from central government departments, MHCLG, Cabinet Office, DEFRA, to deliver large projects at scale for the entire sector. So I guess, as you said earlier, we see things from both sides of the fence. We see things from a central perspective, but we also see things from an impact on the ground, local perspective. And so it's a really privileged role that we can have. Local partnerships. Partnerships is key. We're about brokering those relationships across the sector to make things happen. So we often get involved in those sort of thorny, sticky projects where stuff has been stuck and we can leverage our partnership ecosystem to make things move. So whether that's supporting the LGA, as we are now with its Council House Building Support Service, for example, to unlock the 1.5 million homes, or whether it's supporting DEFRA with its Waste Infrastructure Development Programme and the transition, given EPR and all those sorts of things. We're often kind of at that interface between local and central.
And I know that one of the things that people feel about that is that it also, there's a credibility and a sort of sense that you have the sector's interests at heart and you're not external to it. You're for the sector and of the sector as well as serving the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. We're an LLP, but so we're owned by the public sector for the public sector. So we don't make a profit. Our job is to cover our costs plus 5 to 10%. And 50% of that is redistributed back to the owners for sector-wide improvement work. So everything that we do make is then ploughed back into sector-wide improvement support work. For example, the report that we did with you guys.
So yeah, you mentioned the report that we did together. We're going to talk a bit about that in a sec, but you have been doing, and we have been doing, and we have jointly been doing lots of work with councils in different parts of England around devolution. I guess taking a step back, and I'm conscious also that there are places in which devolution and LGR, local government reorganisation, are not happening. So I want to talk a bit later about some of the other things that are happening in the sector. But why do you think it is important to focus on devolution?
Well, I think is really important because it determines where decisions are made and who is accountable, and I guess how resources can be aligned to deliver impact. So obviously we're living through a time where councils are facing acute financial pressures, rising demand. Obviously you all heard about the adults' health, children's social services. The need to transform and to drive inclusive growth is, I guess, more acute than ever before. And governance and powers are no longer abstract questions. They're actually a delivery question. So it's really important that we get to grips with the kind of mechanics, which is, again, why we work together on the report.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing the need to better join up the various challenges that have been bottlenecks or limitations to systems before. So transport integration, skills pipelines, innovation, these things need to be solved at a regional scale, but there are other things, whether it's community safety, prevention, social care, those pathways need decisions, I guess, closer to people we talk about. So devolution in that sense needs to kind of be tackled at the most effective layer, and that alignment and accountability piece is kind of really where it needs to be at.
Yeah.
Moment. And obviously, wrap around economic resilience and reform and net zero obligations and transitions as well. It's a complicated time to be working and delivering in government. So now more than ever before, that devolution layer and what it's there to deliver is really an important part of the overall local government jigsaw.
Okay, I think it's a complicated time. May take is the most diplomatic statement I've heard so far in 2026. Yes, it certainly is complicated, and I think that's really interesting. That your emphasis there on. I mean, I think that sometimes some of us democratic and governance aspects of devolution, which are really important, but we often focus on those. And your point, quite rightly, is that actually this is also really about the future of public service delivery. Not only how are we making decisions about it, but where is it happening? What are the geographies? How does it connect? If we want to transform public services, we have to engage with that dynamic through the lens of devolution and devolved decision making.
Yep.
So the government, and I know that there'll be some things you'll feel you can say about this. The white paper the government published just over a year ago, feels like longer, they presented as a really ambitious program for devolution. I think I would tend to agree that it was an ambitious program. Do you agree? And if so, how has that actually kind of landed and resonated around the country with councils in your experience?
I get asked this question quite a lot from various bits of Whitehall as well as on kind of local bases. But I guess I'd summarise the response really simply and say, I think the sector's responded with ambition, but with pragmatism. I generally do believe those two words. So it's an ambitiously pragmatic and it's a pragmatically ambitious response. I think there's a huge appetite to secure the kind of clearer powers, that decision making, that longer term funding horizon and kind of long term funding horizon, and the coherent framework to kind of place leadership that many people have said has been missing in different parts of the country. So I think where we see local areas, when they can see a pathway from kind of strategy to delivery, whether that's through the combined authorities or county deals or the kind of more mature joint committee structure, there is enthusiasm to move at pace, and that's where stuff really works. But I think there are probably three-ish sort of caveats where, there are still kind of thorns and question marks about how you mobilise if the things are missing. And that sort of fiscal realism is a reality. You cannot deliver transformative outcomes without predictable, long-term, multi-year funding settlements and sensible conditions and parameters around that. So the short-term pot era we've talked about, the frequent rebadging of pots and the complex bidding cycles really does erode that capacity and confidence. I really do think Whitehall Government Cab Office have heard this very loud and clear and is absolutely acting on it. But as ever, it's complicated. and very difficult to get those mechanics to be aligned all at the same time and in the same way, not least in the context of this thing called LGR kind of panning out and organizational complexity around it. I think, again, our report touched a little bit on this and the sorts of things that you need to consider in that context. I do think that institutional clarity piece is a sort of phrase I've heard used, that councils want to understand, the end state of English devolution. And yes, as the white paper goes, a very good way to articulating that, but then there are clearly practical considerations and questions around making it happen and enabling it. So how do these different models relate? How are powers graduating over time? What is the kind of cyclicality of all of that? How do you avoid duplication across the tiers? Those are all very live questions that we're working through with councils as part of LGR, and the sort of governance structures required. And then there's the capacity and capability piece that we talk about a lot, don't we? Councils are already stretched. Very sort of specialist support is needed at the moment, whether it's governance, program management, commercial assurance, a lot of data and digital capacity and capability needed to get stuff in order. Luckily, that's the bread and butter of what we do, but a lot of complexity in terms of making that happen. So ambitious pragmatism, but things to consider around that kind of fiscal piece, the institutional piece, and the capacity piece.
And as you said, we did a report together back in November looking at the future of combined authorities, mayoral strategic authorities. And I think we concluded that there was lots of sort of evidence of what works well and what doesn't work so well and within existing combined authorities, but that, as you said, there wasn't that kind of institutional clarity from government about exactly what the role of a strategic authority is going to be, exactly what the functional division of responsibilities with constituent local authorities should be, and the sort of roadmap about, where is this going and what should it look like by, not just by 2030, but by 2040, 2050, that kind of sort of state making or sort of governance framework. What does it look like as a vision of the country was perhaps slightly lacking. If you were advising ministers, you are advising ministers and advising local authorities in terms of how you align. Okay, you've got that challenge around the fiscal, you've got the challenge around the sort of institutional clarity, you've got the challenge around the capacity. Those things are real, right? And they won't be met by government just saying, oh, this is our program and everything needs to happen all at once. It seems to me there is a risk that if we don't resolve those issues, a very ambitious program ends up being a bit piecemeal, ends up being fragmentary. You end up, instead of creating a sort of uniformity of devolution across the country, you deepen the current level of kind of patchwork. You make it more patchy. What needs to happen to sort of bring those things together so that we do end up with a kind of an aggregate effect, a sort of development, rather than just a sort of patchwork of great things happening in one place and nothing happening in another?
Yeah, I think, I could answer this in different ways and we could have a whole hour on this question alone, but we'll try and sort of keep it simple and high level. I do think that there is an acknowledgement, and there needs to be an acknowledgement, that long-term system-wide approaches and perspective is required in all of this. And the reality is institutional building takes time. So, the governance choices that we are making now, the committee structures, the scrutiny, the financial frameworks, the partnership protocols, all those sorts of things are shaping the institutional capacity for a decade or more. So I think, the people who understand that, are in tune with that, will be the ones who kind of win out longer term. And then there's a lot about that transition overlap. You and I have talked previously about the relay baton. It's kind of my phrase, but it's the way I see it, that quite often when you're talking about different organizations working together, you talk about team here, team there, but there's very little about what happens when that person running from A to B is literally passing that baton over. Get it right, you win the race. Get it wrong, drop the baton, it's game over. And I think we've all seen the examples in sector, haven't we, metaphorically, where that baton is dropped. So again, part of the reason for this report is to ensure that where those baton drop-off points could occur, that there is mitigation in place from the outset. So leaders need to see that kind of sequence, not siloed kind of plans to reform and to avoid fatigue or indeed duplication. And then I think, now is the chance for that place-based competitiveness to kind of come to the fore in a positive way. Total place, whole place, whatever you want to call it. I know there's been various iterations, sort of legacy approach to place, but now more than ever before, you've got to align that skills piece, as we've talked about, that's often been dealt with separately, to the transport piece, to the housing piece, to the climate investment, the resilience piece, and understanding kind of all of those components of a place and of a region is really key. So that long-term lens can affect the kind of investment in relationships and operating models, and indeed investment into the regions in the right kind of positive way. It's the collaborative kind of muscle memory that needs to retain and reinvent itself.
And I love the relay baton is a really powerful way of visualizing it. You talked about total place or place-based, whatever we want to call it. What's your sense of the appetite for that? Because I guess when people say to me, oh, are we going to do total place again? As someone who's maybe too cynical, maybe been knocking around too long, my sort of response is, did we ever do it in the first place? And I think the lesson for me, from the first iteration of total place back in whatever it was, 2008, was that it didn't, it sort of foundered because actually a lot of the big budgets didn't get behind it, so actually health never really engaged with it. DWP, as they were then, didn't really engage with it. So it ended up not being total place, but a sort of total place lens on some fragmentary elements of place. And my worry is that that's, there's a sort of tendency in government to do that because government silos into big spending departments, and it's very hard to join that up. Do you see devolution as we'll talk about LGR in a moment, but I guess devolution and LGR together, does that give us the groundwork to actually take that idea seriously this time around?
Oh, it's a great question. I wasn't around in the sector at the time, although I was supporting the sector sort of from the other side of the fence in a consultancy guise. But I would say, going back to the points I've mentioned earlier, I regularly spend time in meetings with Cabinet Office colleagues or MHCLG or DEFRA, and that understanding the kind of matrix management across Whitehall, I think is kind of much more there now than perhaps it would have been 10, 15, 20 years ago. The digital capabilities we all have at our disposal means we can share data, have the same data at the same time more readily than perhaps was the case in 2000 for sure. So I do think that kind of wider horizon, what I call matrix management approach to understanding thorny issues is definitely very much embedded across the Whitehall system. The challenge now is to making the very complicated regional and local system marry that. And that's precisely what LGR is meant to do. It's meant to simplify structures, isn't it?
It is. So we've talked a lot about devolution. Let's talk specifically about LGR. When you look at the sector, I know you're doing a lot of work trying to support councils through LGR. Where are we? Is it what's working, what's not working? What do we need to change to make a success of that process?
Yeah, we're obviously in what I call a sort of selective, opportunistic-led reorganisation phase, where clearly some are on a faster programme than others. And I think some areas have moved quite decisively, where there's local consensus, business cases, simplification, all that kind of stuff, and alignment with the wider devolution piece we've talked about. But equally, there are some areas where they're probably still grappling with the political complexity of that region. But in terms of what's working well, I would say that the service simplification piece and the strategic coherence is welcomed by residents, businesses, and I think most of the political fraternities. New unitaries that can, I guess, integrate strategy, commissioning and delivery across kind of core areas like planning, housing, that's waste, that's reducing duplication across the system is obviously a good thing. There is something about needing to see the pace of decision making and accountability kind of ramp up. So again, a single tier governance structure should theoretically shorten decision chains and clarity of who's responsible for what. Obviously, it remains to be seen with new areas, but ultimately on paper, that is exactly what is meant to happen and should happen. And again, a huge bit where we get involved, the commercial side of things, that procurement and commercial leverage. Now is the chance for the sector to really leverage its unified buying power and contract management at pace and scale. And, the reality is a lot of what we find with where finances have gone awry, it's because contracts are diverse, contracts are expensive. Once I think the local government ecosystem understands the buying power that it has collectively or as larger units, I think further savings and efficiencies and sort of commercial pragmatism can ensue. So a lot of good things that can arise. But I think there are still quite a few things that perhaps aren't working or need more ironing out. Obviously, the compressed timelines are very difficult for many. That clearly does create bottlenecks and stresses in teams, particularly some of the core finance, ICT, HR, that sort of legal transition stuff. If it's not carefully managed or managed with due diligence and appropriate due diligence, obviously that could come back to bite you further down the line. There is still a little bit about that unclear interface that we've talked about in different regions where there is going to be a mayoral authority or MCA or, there's going to be different regional powers. That intersection, again, that baton piece between spatial planning and where different local plan versus kind of the macro regional plan sit. The net zero funding streams, where they go, where they sit. There's some complexity around that at the moment. And general business engagement. So quite a few things to sort out. And obviously there's the legacy complexity, with complex pensions in local government, complex assets and liabilities, complex estate, complex harmonisation of terms and conditions, and not least the cultural integration. These are huge things that we need to do, and they would take FTSE 250s an awful lot of time to do this, whereas we're expected to do it in a matter of months. So the challenge is not to be underestimated, and huge hats off to the sector for rising to that challenge and delivering broadly on the timelines that's set by central government.
Absolutely. And when we think about LGR, I guess one of the sort of things on which there are different approaches, and again, there's probably no right answer, but we're seeing some places saying, look, this bit of the process is very much about the transition, making sure we're safe and legal on day one, which is essential, of course. But transformation, public service transformation, culture, etc., that is all for the new unitaries to do because they will have leadership teams, they will have elected leaders, they will have a mandate. That transformation is for them. We see other people saying, well, no, we need to make sure now, as we start to building these new unitaries, that we're getting the design principles right, that we're building a transformative effect to public service delivery, that we're thinking differently about how we engage communities, whether that's through area boards or committees. And actually, if we wait until post vesting day, it's too late. You've got to do that now. No doubt, there's a spectrum there, and presumably the answer is somewhere in the middle. Where would you sort of advise people to be thinking on that spectrum?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I am sort of asked it in slightly different ways, and I guess I look at it from a perspective as what does success look like? So when a new unitary is created post vesting day, so what does day one post vesting day look like? As you say, a lot of the effort is going up to that safe and legal, but the stuff doesn't happen on day one. There's so much you need to be doing by way of groundwork before. So we advise our councils that we're working with on thinking about how are you going to show and demonstrate that you are that organisation that's moved quickly from standing itself up to genuinely functioning as one coherent council, so that one voice, that one coherence is there. How are you going to make sure that your core services are stable and uninterrupted? Residents can't be experiencing cracks. They need to have that smooth transition rather than sort of the mechanics of reorganisation. And again, that's yet to be tested in some of the kind of areas undergoing it right now. Staff absolutely need to know how decisions are made, who's accountable, how to navigate the new operating model. There's no good people rocking up day one to a new organisation. They don't know who their line managers are or who is effectively heading their services or systems. And believe me, that has been the case in previous iterations. So we kind of need to get all of that right. The leadership team absolutely has to be aligned and visible from day one around priorities and shifting focus from day one from that structural change to the outcome delivery piece. And obviously all of that financial control stuff, governance, take that as read, that needs to be in place. But I do think that cultural piece, as you said, is important. From day one, people need to feel that they belong to a single organisation. They can't arrive and wait for the new leadership team to set out their vision. Otherwise, it is in danger of becoming a group of legacy councils coming together. So that cultural piece cannot be underestimated and does actually need to be started right now, even if the new leadership is not clear. And, I speak to a number of chief execs who are very much, well, I don't want to make that decision because it might not be me, it might be somebody else. But you've got to be brave, you've got to be bold, you've got to kind of set some context and parameters so that partners, particularly externally, see joined up authorities, confident places. In essence, sort of success today means momentum for tomorrow. I think long-winded way of answering a question, but that cultural piece is often underestimated, but it's the most crucial. We talk about culture eating strategy for breakfast, don't we? It's a well-used phrase, but that ultimately what makes things fall down, it's people. It's rarely processes or systems, or the processes and systems fall down if people and relationships have fallen down.
That's really, really helpful, a really important message, because yes, that I understand that hesitance. It's so much for leaders, whoever they end up being. You have to sort of hold all of this at the same time, and I totally get how challenging that is. But yeah, we hear people saying, "Well, I might not. It might. We don't know who." But you're right. That sort of we just have to have the courage to seize it and start creating that early on. I think that's really important. Look, that's a lot on LGR because LGR is a lot, Devo is a lot. But of course, local government is a big beast, right? And there's a lot of other stuff going on. What are the other big policy issues that you see coming through that councils really need to focus on?
I mean, it's still the kind of same buckets of what we've talked about. So that financial resilience and sustainability, service sustainability piece, I think is key. But there is that sort of more fundamental question of what is local government here to do? And as I'm not quite sure that's been addressed fully enough at the moment. Now is the chance to not only think we have to continue the services we have on a slightly larger footprint. It's, well, are the services fit for purpose in a 21st century digital kind of landscape, not least if devolution and combined authorities are going to different things. So that kind of radical kind of approach to what a local government footprint should look like, I think, is being discussed in some quarters more than others, but that's certainly something that we're seeing more on the radar. There's obviously the stabilisation piece. We've talked about the pressured services, and there's the still net zero and climate adaptation, resilience and risk work. So we're getting brought in a lot more to do that sort of scenario planning, that kind of worst case design to make sure the regional ecosystem stacks up. So police, crime, health, working well in crisis and kind of climate adaptation guises. Quite a lot of work that needs to happen there. Unfortunately, the floods and the adverse weather conditions we're seeing is going one way, the wrong way. So local ecosystems need to be able to work together in different ways and perhaps more complicated ways than they have done hitherto. So again, we're part and parcel of a lot of that resilience planning work.
Flooding in particular opens up a whole set of kind of governance issues that we haven't got time for today. It's massive. What's really important is that we're also seeing, rightly, I think, that even in local authorities, in areas where actually some of the sort of current structural change that doesn't directly sort of impact them because they're already unitary authorities working in a combined authority, they are still starting to ask those fairly fundamental questions about what is local government here to do? What should public services look like? How do we sort of manage all this at sub-regional and local level? I think that feels to me like quite an encouraging development, actually. Because I think that's more true. Well, what's your perspective? I think that feels like it's more true now than it was even 3 or 4 years ago.
I think it is. And I think, we often talk about the democratic deficit of residents not being engaged in local elections, and we can talk at length about turnout in elections, etc. But I think there is more happening on the ground in terms of residents and across all cohorts of society, younger generations, older generations, sort of getting together, talking, connecting, trying to think more about place and society, not least in the context of everything we see in our press. I'm not going to make any political commentary, broken Britain, etc., but I think people are thinking much more about how do I fit me, myself, and I within a community? What kind of community do I want to be part of? And that by default, ladders up to then the local authority ecosystem, meeting new groups, meeting new people, new cohorts of society to kind of engineer services and support required for them. I think there's probably more happening that we're not seeing because it's not embedded in the sort of traditional ways in which we've engaged with our residents and businesses. But again, lots of interesting stuff, I think, happening in different parts of the country in terms of how they're doing their listening exercise, how they're building their local plans, how they're working with residents and businesses on climate resilience. There's lots of really good stuff happening that I think will come through in new service design eventually over a couple of years.
100% agree. And I think for the sector, the challenge is how do we make sure we build on, we surf that wave of energy rather than just running it parallel to it, is a really big challenge. So things are challenging out there. There is a lot of, political contestation. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of turbulence. We're all aware of that. But I'm also, I guess at LGIU, and I suspect this applies at local partnerships as well. We're sort of by definition professional optimists. We wouldn't do this if we didn't think there were ways of making things better and there wasn't sort of things to build on and scope to keep improving. So what are the things when you're sort of, I won't ask you for sort of trite reasons for hope, but as you think about your work program out over 2026, what are the things that you are looking forward to? What are the things you're looking forward to working with councils on?
Well, that's a good question. I am excited. I am a glass half full person, always have been, rather than the kind of doom warrior, as it were. But I really am quite optimistic, actually, because I can see the determination and the ingenuity, if you like, across local government. I can see the can do. We've got to make this happen. We've got to make it work. Let's do it. Let's mobilise. That's the bread and butter of public service. And I'm seeing that in abundance across the ecosystem, even though there's acknowledgement it's difficult. Our job, as I said, alongside delivering that value and efficacy for public purse, is to turn local and central government ambition into reality and reliable delivery. And we are completely excited to be kind of literally working at the heart of that day in, day out. I guess I'd answer in more general sort of chief exec type terms, but I am looking forward to ensuring that we continue to support long-term play strategies that really stick. So helping leaders create those governance, financial structures, the delivery capacity that endure beyond electoral cycles. As I say, step outside of the politics, and what's going to work for the longer term is absolutely what we're about. The net zero and decarbonisation piece is still core to what we do and core to what's needed, whether that's homes, whether it's public estate, whether it's fleet, heat networks. We work very closely with DEFRA and other central government departments and DESNAs to make sure these aren't just strategies, but they're visible pipelines of projects that ultimately, drive job growth, creations, and resilience. And then, as I say, that interface between local, regional, national governments is where we're going to be working a lot this year. We've been really proud to be the delivery partner for the LGA on its council house building support service, for example. So that's, tangible example of us really working with the sector. I think we've got 85 councils we're working with at the moment to help them shore up the pipeline to be able to deliver those homes. So where there's been bottlenecks or stuff has been stalled or stuck, we've got all sort of Avengers Assemble like teams to go in and help support and mobilize and move that stuff quickly. So wherever we can see we're making a tangible, practical difference to moving the dial on those key government priorities, I guess what makes a lot of my colleagues get out of bed every day and be proud to come work for the public sector.
Yeah. I mean, that's tremendously exciting. And I think, there's a sort of tired narrative, isn't there, about sort of local government is sort of bureaucratic and jobs worthy. And that's, like you, that's not what I see. What I see is a sort of can do attitude linked to some really sort of practical delivery on really difficult, complex challenges. And that is tremendously exciting. So, yeah, we don't need to get into the politics of Britain broken or not, but there is an awful lot of building and doing and making out there that we should celebrate and that's exciting to be involved with.
Exactly. Good time to be around.
Yes, it is. That is a. I'm gonna stop us there because that's a brilliantly positive note. And so let's end on a high. Adele, thank you so much for joining us. That was a really fascinating sort of tour of the horizon and some of the really fascinating work that you and colleagues are doing. And as I say, we've very much enjoyed being part of a little bit of that work and look forward to doing more with you as we both work with the sector in the months and years to come. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to everyone who's listened or watched this session. I'm sure you will have enjoyed it. We'll be back soon with more expert interviews. But in the meantime, you can find us and our whole archive of conversations like this and Ask the Expert events and policy papers and everything on lgiu.org. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you soon.